And hello there, Twitch and YouTube, Discord and Tiki and W. Kiara, who has met the goal. In fact, enough for this week. Uh, it has been a hell of a week. It's been exhausting. I'm in pain. Huge W to Kiara, please. Everybody, thanks to our resident MILF. Yay. Yeah, so we stopped reading almost 3 weeks ago. And we got to the end of part 2, which is Feminism. The MILF next door is wild. I love that. And yeah, it's been an interesting time because a lot of the conversations that the writers of color were having at the festival had to do with things like abolition. And when I raised abolition feminism, a lot of the black writers said that they rejected feminism in its current iteration, which I completely understand. Yes, I have also rejected the title of feminist, but you can still practice the tenets of liberation while not actually attaching yourself to a title or a movement. And when they asked, what do you mean by abolition feminism, we were talking about this book and the kind of movements that were necessitated out of the unequal kind of a footing that black and brown women find themselves within the judicial system, and how the system of carceral justice, quote unquote, impacts women and femmes of color, and especially gender diverse people as a whole, within the racist, patriarchal, capitalist system that is supported by carceral justice systems. And so these talks that we were having were really interesting because our South African context, although it is vastly different to the system in the US, there's so many similarities in how we approach our feminism, especially from a standard white feminist lens that we are taught from the time that we're in our first year of university. Especially if we do things like gender studies, we are given this version of feminism that completely rejects, or not rejects, because you would think to reject would be to actually acknowledge something in the first place. It completely disregards and overlooks, thank you, Anachronista. It overlooks and disregards the lived reality of women and femmes of color. And when you do that, you have a case of you are overlooking the people who are not just the most marginalized in society, but are actively harmed by not just white womanhood, but by white women's insistence on the carceral system being the only way forward in how to protect women and femmes from gendered violence. So we get to part 3. We are on page 127 if you are following along. And this is the third part of the title of the book. We've spoken about abolition, we've spoken about feminism, and now we're speaking about the present. What happens now? It is April 10th, 2020, and ample early spring sunshine across meadows almost obscures the reality. This is a car caravan circling a prison during a pandemic. Almost 1 month into the statewide shelter-in-place order in Illinois, before George Floyd, before Breonna Taylor, before Tony McDade, and with 12 COVID-19 related deaths reported, Stateville Prison in Crestville is a national hotspot, like many other prisons across the country. The National Guard is overseeing medical services, Masks and hand sanitizer are scant, and people inside are on 24-hour lockdown. As the virus accelerated in the early spring, with increased infections and reports of death, family members, loved ones, and grassroots community-based organizations moved with urgency to push for people's release. Despite demands for furlough, compassionate release, and clemency, no one from this maximum security prison for people the state designates as men, with a population of approximately 3,500 people, has been released. While COVID-19's lethality is in confined spaces reportedly led to action in others, Indonesia, Iran, India, relatively few people were released from US state prisons over the course of the pandemic, despite the vibrancy of a movement to defund the police. It's telling. It's very telling that people were all of a sudden there was no clemency given to anyone. And especially in a place like Illinois, where the majority of people incarcerated are black. The caravan gets scraggly because of the length of the journey. It takes about 15 minutes to make a full circle around the prison, which commands an impressive 2,200 acres. The cars follow a truck towing a giant speaker, blasting music, and a 30-minute Zoom program that includes pre-recorded comments from people inside who describe the situation as desperate. Thank you. The names of the known dead are read. Key organizers, formerly incarcerated women, also testified. This multiracial caravan consisted largely of women, children, and young people, and queer people. As many in the caravan are regular visitors to this prison, loved ones, educators, attorneys, it feels exhilarating to circle in cars decorated with signs, "Release them all, abolition now." Perhaps anticipating an insurgency, the prison blocks every entrance with law enforcement vehicles and armed officers. Do you remember that scene in V for Vendetta, when the people are marching toward Parliament, all in their what masks? Guy Fawkes masks. And the army is marching forward towards the people. What he says in that moment, what V says in that moment, is the government will respond in the only way it knows how. When governments are created through violence, especially colonial violence, their only response to any crisis is more violence. The day-to-day violence notwithstanding. The day-to-day violence is things like incarceration, things like clamping down on freedom of speech in schools. So many things are can be considered day-to-day violence that are overlooked, that are not considered violence because they're so normalized. But what is setting up huge fences and surrounding these buildings with law enforcement, if not violence, or at least the threat of violence? During the pandemic, car caravans like these, circling prisons, jails, and other detention centers, erupted all over the country. Premature death from COVID-19 galvanized these demands, yet people were always already dying too early in prisons anyway. Medical neglect, overcrowding, bad food, cramped cells, limited access to things like condoms, and communal eating led to preventable and infectious diseases, including hepatitis, HIV, and diabetes. Cruel and exploitative conditions, like price gouging in the commissary and telecommunications, along with the scarcity of soap, menstrual supplies, toilet paper, these are all normalized conditions. So, just a thought. If these are the conditions within prisons every day, in a country that claims to be the most advanced and richest in the world and the most technologically savvy and yada 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 yakety schmackety blah blah blah. If these are the conditions in prisons every single day, what are the conditions at ICE detention centers? Food for thought. Before COVID-19, 80 to 100 people were dying every year in Illinois prisons, according to the data the state was forced to make publicly available. Forced to make available. This number does not include casualties from the approximately 250,000 times people cycle through Illinois' 92 county jails, or the counts from federal prison and other detention centers. Incarceration itself has always been a pandemic. The emergency response to the outbreak of the pandemic in Illinois was organized by groups composed largely of women of color, queer folk, and young people. Leading up to the caravan, this informal network called the planning meetings, made agendas, took notes, knitted relationships, hustled meager resources, held down the day's logistics, and instigated action debriefs. It takes a lot to do that. And this is something that I've been thinking all day, is that we need to remember our purpose. We need to remember what we are here for, what we have come together to do. Yes, creating community is important. And in creating community, we create the conditions under which we can do this kind of work. But we need to remember what our work is and to do that work. And now I'm going to read you something that I wrote in my server general chat the other day. I was feeling incredibly down and I had read way too many pieces on Palestine that morning. And at about 3 p.m., I just felt raw and just so gutted. I want to ask people who are not doing the work in any way, when they eat apathy in abundance, what does the indifference taste like? Does it taste like privilege, safety, fear? Or does it taste like the blood of the people whose lives they devalue? Is it still blood if they think those people aren't human enough? I learned racism before I learned to write, and I was 4 when I learned to write my name that people still get wrong. My skin enters every room before I do, and I see the hands of privilege hold others gently, while it holds my people by the throat, forever tightening like a lover who never loved you back but wanted to control what you give. I'm a child shaped by empire, but the shape of me and my people will never be accepted, just like the foreign tongue I mastered to please the masters, discarding my own as if I could shed my color if I sounded just a little more like them. I hold entire histories in my body, but my rage is dismissed like a storm too far out at sea, and I sink into a whirlpool of silence, swallowing my pain like poison. So what does indifference taste like? These kind of responses to the crisis of COVID-19, the crisis that we faced as individual societies and as humankind at large, the way people and communities stayed afloat, stayed alive, stayed managing in any way possible was through community work, was through grassroots organization. Thank you. we had a C19 People's Coalition here in South Africa that was fighting for a universal basic income grant. And that grant has not been given. It's 6 years later since we started actively fighting for it. And yeah, people are still fighting. Those grassroots movements still exist. And when people ask me in all of these movements, like, where do you see yourself? Like, where do you see this movement in 5 years' time? And I have the same answer every time. I say, I hope this organization has no purpose in 5 years. I hope we don't have to continue fighting for the same thing in 5 years. I hope that, we achieve what we aim to do so that I can worry about honeybees. So yes, please, let's remember why we came together as a community in the first place. Thank you so much. Why did we form community in the first place? This reflects the pre-pandemic reality. The waiting room in the prisons was always full of mothers, wives, lovers, sisters, daughters. The women who waited to visit now helped to organize car caravans, deliver emergency supplies, and call for decarceration now. Although some of those circling the prison that day identify as abolitionists and feminists, the work is not widely recognized as feminist, even gendered, labor. It's not recognized as labor. Visiting a loved one in prison is not considered labor. Organizing for decarceration is not considered labor. Grassroots organizing is not considered labor. And the idea that a lot of people have now is like, I can't join a grassroots organization because I'm not getting paid for it. I get a lot of people saying, I'm not getting paid for it, so I'm not going to do it. Hi, Smosh. My parents never got paid for liberating this country. What are the costs of this erasure? The failure to make visible and to name feminism's indivisibility from abolition. And it's not just the ideologies that get swept under the rug. It's who does the work. Fast forward several months in 2020 to another crisis, mobilization, more labor, and action. On the July 4th weekend in Chicago, with the COVID-19 quarantine still in effect, hundreds of people turned out in person for defund Chicago Police Department's mass resistance trainings. With the social media call to show up for an orientation to police or prison abolition and discussion of how we are going to defund the police in Chicago and how we can use organizing, direct action, and movement building to win. This weekend was organized just days in advance by a new collective that mobilized almost overnight, the Black Abolitionist Network, or BAN. Hi, AC. The 4-hour sessions on each day over the long weekend, an outdoor event with physical distancing, masks, and hand sanitizer, centered accessibility in a range of ways that included providing excellent food, free childcare, breaks, and sign language interpretation. Located in neighborhoods across Chicago, while the mercury was rising, these trainings, with many young queer black women running operations and workshops, were booked out almost immediately. Everybody wants to attend these workshops. Everybody wants to attend the training and, all of those kinds of things, but nobody wants to put in the legwork. From cleaning the empty lots where the trainings were held to creating a dynamic that encouraged visionary thinking, organizers created a space for imagining a different world. Just like the car caravan around Stateville Prison, Chicago's July 4th weekend was abolition feminism at work. In the summer of 2020, sustained public demands to disinvest, shrink, or abolish, not reform, policing and for abolition now emerged after decades of practice, experimentation, and critical assessment. These forms of praxis, and collective engagement do the slow work of both of deconstruction or a critique and disavowal of the carceral state, and the labor of a productive experimentation, the creation and engagement with fresh tools, shared analysis, and language. These years also proliferated our ability to dream audaciously. A feminist writer and organizer, Gloria Anzaldúa, wrote in 1987, "Nothing happens in the real world unless it first happens in images in our heads." That is beautiful. Nothing happens in the real world unless it first happens in the images in our heads. That's important to remember. Because if we can imagine a world without prisons, if we can imagine a world without police, if we can imagine a world that is different, what else can we imagine and make real? Over time, these varied manifestations of abolition feminism deepened our collective imagination. The state does not offer the solution to interpersonal violence, and existing forms of state protection, including police, prisons, and social welfare programs, create more violence and harm. And we've been through, so far, the whole book, going through how they create harm. Collective formations of abolition feminism, ad hoc and formal, from the Combahee River Collective to Sisters Uncut, from the germinal anti-violence work of the National Black Women's Health Project to the founding of Insight, continue to build daily responses to a range of harms while working to challenge systemic and cultural forms of state violence. These small networks, some persisting across decades, exemplify the practice and politics of abolition feminism. Turning to the everydayness of one site, Chicago, this chapter engages with the last 2 decades of abolition feminist organizing and the daily and collective experiments of living otherwise. Yet Chicago is not exceptional. There are multiple chapters to be written about: Johannesburg, Montreal, Seattle, and many other sites. However, we argue that even a partial focus on the everydayness of a particular location offers the opportunity to both surface the power of small, hyperlocal, and sometimes fleeting actions, as well as networks, and map the archive the ongoing cumulative and collective impact of these often tiny formations that make a huge difference. And it really does make a huge difference. When she talks about Johannesburg, how we went from the state of our prisons here to what they are now. Ben Musa, salam. Kif halek habibi? Oh, I'm glad to hear that. It's good to see you. Alhamdulillah. To look at these tiny formations and then to place them in conjunction with the larger narrative and the larger framework, we have so much that so many people are fighting for in their own communities, in the schools in the school district that they work in the in sometimes completely unrelated to anything that we talk about here on TikTok, but it does make a difference because you see how one school getting getting a qualified psychologist instead of just a counselor, and fighting for getting a psychologist into the school can help an entire community. And it has a knock-on effect. Sorry, it was an urgent message. I'm going to need to deal with that soon. Okay, so I've been reading for about 30 minutes now. Any questions or comments? Because when we look at how these tiny little movements impact the greater machinery of resistance, they're often forgotten. So we need to insist on attention being paid to these smaller movements and how they impact the larger movements. B, learning is all fine and well. Where's the praxis? And that is my key question, is where is the praxis? So they write, insisting on attention to now defunct organizations, largely forgotten campaigns, highly local events, and small collectives. This chapter illuminates the rich historical movement of abolition feminism as a method. And that is why we need to locate it in now, and how we can organize now. What benefits can this kind of organizing have now? And locate it in our current contexts. My context is very, very different to the rest of you guys. Abolition feminist practices and analyses do not grow by scaling up or through institutionalized forms of power. Predicated on sameness and often eradicating difference, scaling up can foreclose transformation. A close engagement with one site suggests that an abolition feminist ecology emerges from everyday practices, collective experiments driven by necessity, practice, and reflection, and in sinewy networks that crisscross time and space. Far from utopian, this world is ready at hand, already underway. As the lawyer and organizer Brian Stevenson stated in part of a 2020 to 2021 series of virtual artistic and political engagements titled Visualizing Abolition, the presence of something different is palpable. He said, I just believe there's something better waiting for us. I do believe there's something that feels more like freedom, more like equality, more like justice waiting for us, for all of us. End quote. Remember that. Every conversation we have, every idea that we share, it is a step toward us getting better as individuals and building better communities for the collective. Somebody said to me when I was toxic, I'm still toxic. I have toxicity built into my system. I'm not always going to get it right. It's not past tense. As a history of Chicago's present, and with an ear for the notes at the margins, this chapter aims to chronicle and advance local practices that not only demand but mobilize something better. Now is the time to build, to practice, and yes, to study. Now is the imperative to name how feminism is central to abolition and how abolition is indivisible from our feminism. So, This is going to be quite heavy, and it's only 4.5 pages. Hi, Melon. But I'm going to stop after that because it's heavy. The section is titled The Violence of Policing. On November 24th, 2015, Chicago was again in the streets over the death of another black youth. 17-year-old Laquan McDonald, at the hands of a white police officer. More than a year earlier, Laquan McDonald had been shot 16 times by Jason Van Dyke. Initially ruled a justifiable homicide, the dashcam footage of the entire incident, suppressed both by the blue wall of silence and by complicit city officials, was released only after 13 months of relentless pressure from independent journalists, Laquan McDonald's family, and a network of small community-based organizations. The footage was devastating. 30 seconds after he arrived at the scene, Van Dyke fired his gun at McDonald, who was not lunging toward the police, but running away. Until recently, the varied forms of police violence and their familiar targets, black and brown people, poor people, queer people, labor organizers, sex workers, migrants, rarely made headlines. The police killings of Native Americans, the most unlikely of any racial or ethnic group to be killed by U.S. law enforcement, still rarely receive mainstream media coverage. The National Center for Transgender Equality's U.S. Transgender Survey reported in 2015 that 58% of those surveyed who had had contact with police or law enforcement officers reported some form of mistreatment. Also made invisible is the slow violence of how other carceral entities, such as social services, police bodies, targeting poor women who are overwhelmingly black or indigenous, for example, in mandated and random drug tests for meager social assistance benefits like temporary assistance for needy families. Policing in its varied forms has always been a pandemic. Chicago has deep histories of resistance to this ongoing violence of policing. Just a few years before McDonald's death, in 2012, the network We Charge Genocide raised the visibility of another young black person killed by a white police officer, 22-year-old Rekia Boyd. I was a young journalist when this came up. I remember my white editor saying, "It happens all the time." I'm like, huh? This is a story worth covering. No, it happens all the time. I did the story anyway. Much to his displeasure. The group demanded measures of accountability beyond prosecution, and in 2014, the We Charge Genocide submitted a shadow or unofficial report to the UN, Police Violence Against Chicago's Youth of Color, documenting the fact that police officers regularly engage in torture. Among their 20 recommendations, We Charge Genocide insisted on defining and creating safety outside of a carceral framework and building alternatives to policing and imprisonment. By 2015, the response to McDonald's death and the police cover-up felt different from previous uprisings in response to the violence of policing. And when we say policing, we don't just mean the men in blue. All forms of policing serve carceral culture. while calls to prosecute Jason Van Dyke surfaced immediately, and the chants in the street were familiar: no justice, no peace, no racist police. Different strategies and demands for accountability and transformation gained traction. With almost 40% of Chicago's operating budget already earmarked for policing, 15% of the city's total budget including grants, in a political moment where austerity logic justified the closure of public schools and public mental health centers in black and brown neighborhoods, a network of grassroots activists pushed not to prosecute but to shrink the footprint of policing. In the wake of MacDonald's death, the demand to fund black futures and to divest from policing as a pathway to safety and accountability resonated across new audiences. This was abolition feminism in practice. The outrage in Chicago over MacDonald's murder echoed across the country, accentuating the fact that everywhere from New York City to Ferguson to Minneapolis, police kill with impunity. State violence also plays out in other ways, targeting women, trans people, and gender non-conforming people. In the rare cases when state violence is made visible, accountability is thinly individuated. And that is important because individuating violence means that it is not systemic. They can claim that it is not systemic because it's just one bad apple. It is the whole fucking system. The problem is a discrete incident, a specific officer. In 2015, former Oklahoma City police officer Daniel Holtzclaw was convicted of raping 13 black women. In 2020, 2 police officers in Kansas City, Missouri, were indicted after assaulting Breonna Obibi Hill on a city sidewalk. While these prosecutions are rare and convictions rarer, policing is a key mechanism of state violence. The murders of Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, Sandra Bland, and thousands of other black and indigenous women and queer and trans people are grim evidence of the misogynist and transphobic character of policing, which, alongside racism, is expressed in the murder of cisgender men of color. I can't have put it any simpler. Policing was invented with the express purpose of suppressing people of color. Given this landscape, anti-violence organizers and scholars worked to critically examine the gendered and heterosexist dimensions of the violence of policing. Noteworthy among these efforts is the Say Her Name campaign organized and led by Professor Kimberly Crenshaw of the African American Policy Forum. My heart. If anybody knows Kimberly Crenshaw, please tell her I love her and I want to interview her. Thank you. Since releasing the original May 2015 Say Her Name, Resisting Police Brutality Against Black Women report, AAPF has been documenting these specific ways that black women, girls, femmes, and trans people are targets of violent policing, and how silence creates further danger for women who are outside of the gaze of most anti-violence and racial justice activists. From holding public tribunals to co-producing a song by Janelle Monáe, AAPF has challenged the movement to include the names and therefore to never forget the lives of black women killed by police. One key difference in this moment of police violence is that camera phones and social media now document and amplify some of the more recent and egregious instances of state violence. The poet Elizabeth Alexander describes the Trayvon generation. The young people who are growing up watching these murder clips on their phones, on the school bus, undercovers, crisscrossed and concentrated. These graphic real-time assaults, coupled with growing calls for police accountability, sometimes translate into attempts to sanction law enforcement or to implement new measures of policing surveillance, including body cams. Yet the demand for police accountability emanating from the 2020 uprisings increasingly hinged not on reform but on abolitionist calls to divest from the carceral state through critical dialogue, While we know that prosecution and the state will never protect us, what do we do with killer cops, the rapist cops, the transphobic cops that white supremacy and heteropatriarchy produce and protect? Jason Van Dyke was charged with first-degree murder in Chicago on the day the video footage was finally released. 3 other police officers, including his partner, were also charged with conspiracy to cover up Laquan McDonald's murder. While there are undoubtedly individual police officers who are racist and transphobic, systems and institutions empower, educate, validate, and arm these individual actors. Yet, if the criminal legal system is barely equipped to indict its own, it's completely unable to critically examine and indict its own structure. Oof! With approximately 12 civilian complaints in Van Dyke's personal record, largely related to the use of excessive force, an above-average number of complaints for a Chicago police officer. None resulted in any disciplinary action. Through another lens, Van Dyke was neither particularly exceptional nor an outlier. He was just caught. Every time police violence is mentioned, especially when it is mentioned that we are seeing these things in real time on our phones, all of this violence exists in our pockets. It reminds me of Tyree Nichols and how white people defended not the police, but the police's blackness is what made them violent, not the badge. They defend the badge constantly. They didn't this time. And every single white person needs to go and watch that video. And I don't care if you are traumatizing yourself in doing so. I've been reading for 50 minutes. All the love. Stay safe. And I shall see you all next week. I'm going to talk to TikTok just now, to Twitch and YouTube. I shall see you all next week, Tuesday. Yeah. Take care of yourselves. Tuesday we are continuing with Arundhati Roy. I'll see you then.